There were several non-government motions put to Tynwald last week. Chris Thomas narrowly missed out on persuading Tynwald to reopen gas exploration, and John Wannenburgh succeeded in persuading Tynwald and government to do more to back Manx produce. But first, Stu Peters tried to persuade Tynwald to ask the public what they think of Tynwald and government's net zero policies. Is it fair to say you're flogging a dead horse when it comes to trying to convince Tynwald members that the Tynwald policies on net zero should at least be tested in the public domain?
That's the disappointment in this for me, Phil. The fact is that I wasn't questioning net zero or climate change this time. I was saying that we need to gauge public support for government policies, and they won't even do that. So, I mean, how anybody could vote against a referendum on something so important is quite frankly beyond me. The amendment from Mrs. Barber I thought was a complete cop-out, because it meant that people could vote to really not do anything. And the idea from her that the next election will be the test that a referendum would put forward is nonsense. You know, I could vote for a member of the Green Party to be my MHK if I thought that it was a good person and the rest of his policies were good. So, you know, a general election is much too wide to come up with a conclusion on this. So I'm not surprised, but I'm very disappointed.
A lot. I mean, there were an awful lot of contributions, many, in fact, most longer than your own, which perhaps doesn't come as a surprise because you tend to be brief and to the point with your comments. But some of the comments were basically saying that actually you get what you vote for, and it was pretty clear when people were at the election at the polling station in 2021 when they were casting their votes. They kind of knew what direction House of Keys was heading in.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, certainly people were aware of my views on this, and I think that's why people voted for me, because, again, my feeling is that the majority of people do not favour government's policies as far as net zero is concerned. And let me be clear for a final time on this, because I doubt that we'll talk about it again. I'm not against net zero. What I'm against is these arbitrary dates that have been set, which are forcing people to do things rather than just allowing these things to happen. I'm a great believer in the free market economy. You know, when electric cars are cheaper than petrol cars, people will move to them. They don't need to be forced into them. And it's the same with things like, you know, air source or ground source heat pumps. When they're cheaper than a gas boiler, people will use them anyway. And that's the way to achieve net zero, you know, by consensus and by economic viability. And not by government laying down arbitrary dates like 20. You know, somebody said, well, you know, we're aiming for 2050 to be net zero. Yeah, that's fine, but we've also got targets for 2030 and 2035, and they could be ruinous to our economy. You know, that money would be better spent elsewhere.
There are, though, things that the market economy won't solve. So, for example, the climate change adaptation that is happening, perhaps not happening particularly swiftly, but it is happening. So we're speaking the day after the big storm that hit the island it'll be last week by the time this is broadcast, and some flood defences that have been built stopped many houses getting flooded, and that's really where most or the bigger part of the money that's being spent on climate change is going. Surely that's not an unreasonable thing for government to be spending money on.
That's perfectly reasonable. I agree entirely with things like tidal defences. But, you know, let's not get our knickers in a twist about this. Even the IPCC have said that they don't believe that there's a climate emergency. And they were the people that were banging the drum about this for years. They've now said, hang on a second, people are getting too carried away with this. This isn't an emergency. This is a situation that we need to look at carefully and plan our defences. So, you know, sea walls and things like that, I have no problem at all with that. But it's not as though all of a sudden we're getting storms. We've always had storms, we've always had high tides, we've always had flooding and all the rest of it. So the trick is to try and mitigate against that getting worse in the future.
There were lots of quite lengthy comments that came out of the Legislative Council, particularly in relation to this matter. I detected some level of what's the word I'm looking for? Surprise by members of the House of Keys that they were effectively getting lectures by members of Legco that aren't directly elected by the public about democracy.
I thought that was quite funny, yeah. I expected Rob Mercer to vote against and speak against my motion. I expected Paul Crane to do the same, but we do so in a very friendly way, always. Mr. Clewitt kind of took me off guard a bit in that my motion took 5 minutes to deliver, and he was still speaking after half an hour, I think. And what he was referring to mostly was my speech last year. So he was obviously upset by that a year ago, and he's been saving up his ammunition for this time. But it didn't help because he was talking about the pros and cons of climate change, and that wasn't what this motion was about. It was about saying to the people of the Isle of Man at the next election, do you agree with what we're doing or not?
The other response to your motion, the other big point that was being made was we shouldn't really be expecting Deemsters to get involved, effectively weigh into political debate. And unfortunately, because the Act, the 1979 Referenda Act, is, obviously getting a little dated now, that's exactly what's supposed to happen. Deemsters have to decide on what exactly the question is. Do you kind of understand some of those concerns?
Not particularly, no. That's kind of detail, and today wasn't about detail. I don't have any problem at all with the Deemsters setting the question, because if I was to set it, it would be completely biased. I trust the Deemsters to come up with a middle road and a fair question to ask to people. And, there's all this talk about, there's an awful lot of work to do to get the Deemsters and the judiciary involved in this. It's an afternoon's work. I mean, come on.
Is this the last then? It certainly sounds like this is the last that we'll hear from you on this topic in this House of Keys, or have you got other items planned, other thoughts as to how you might convince Tynwald to back your ideas?
I've been trying for 4.5 years to convince Tynwald that they're on the wrong track with this, and they refuse to agree with me. And that's democracy. I've got to stand by that. But just listening to the debate now about our offshore gas fields, we've got a very green Tynwald, I'm afraid. And what that means is that they put their ideology before the benefit of the Isle of Man people. It's a bit off topic, but if we've got a gas field in our territorial waters, we ought to be, digging, baby, dig.
So going back to what actually succeeded then, which was Claire Barber's amendment to your motion, which says actually this whole issue can be decided in the course of the next general election. Presumably, you will be pushing hard to make sure that this item is at the top of every elector's list when it comes to them deciding who they're going to vote for.
No, that was another thing that was said today about, there are going to be campaigns and it's going to be big oil and people sponsoring the campaigns. It's complete nonsense. I wanted a referendum. I don't plan to run a campaign at all. I've made my position clear on it, and the will of Tynwald is not to follow that. So that's the end of it. Even had they agreed with the referendum, I wouldn't campaign about it. People know my position on this. And they have their own point of view, and it's just an awful shame that Tynwald doesn't want to hear their point of view.
That was Middle MHK Stu Peters. Christian Jones caught up with Environment Minister Claire Barber.
I think it's interesting because we do a lot of work within climate change team looking at the public view, doing surveying, trying to pick up where people are at in regards to climate change. And also listening very much to debates we've had in Tynwald and feedback we get from the various departments and bodies that have to do reporting, where we know that some of that work is taking more time than I think we'd initially anticipated, and we're looking at how can we make that easier for people while still making sure that the data that we capture is valid. So a bit of a balancing act. I think the challenge that we have with the way in which this has been framed, it has been well laid out by lots of people today, partly because there are significant issues with the Referendum Act, which we had hoped that Mr Thomas was going to amend through a private member's bill, but that hasn't materialised. Also, in terms of the timing and the risks that would be in play by virtue of there not being any restrictions on funding, for example. I think that was well articulated by David Ashford. And also the fact it's predominantly untested. So you find yourself in a position with something that is scientifically proven. It was interesting that Stu Peters said, I'm not even going to challenge the science actually around this. Being potentially the subject of a referendum, but no clarity what that question would look like, which we know the Deemsters would set. But actually, would one question be enough? Because when I talk to people who do have concerns relating to what we're doing with climate change, it's very rare that it's just a one-size-fits-all piece. Is it we don't think we need an act, or should we not have signed up to the Paris Agreement, or is it that actually we don't want the wind turbines on the east of the island, we'd rather they're on the west, or is it that we don't want them at all? Do we not want them onshore? There's just so many different facets to this that I think trying to pin it down to something such as a referendum, I just don't have confidence it would work. And I think it would also be challenging because of the time frame, because of the Referendum Act, and almost certainly because of a host of other things that we haven't even accounted for as yet.
Well, one of the things you mentioned was that referendums are vulnerable to misinformation. How do you see the climate of misinformation at the moment? Because it seems to be increasing.
Yes, I think it's challenging. We certainly see as government how quickly, and I think that's more the point. I think there's always been misinformation, and I think it's often not done in a malicious manner. I think people have sometimes got the wrong end of the stick for whatever reason. But because of the way social media works, when something that is incorrect goes out, it flies so quickly that trying to catch it and correct it is very tricky. And there's not the sort of typical paths you might have had where who told someone the wrong thing back in the the good old days, 1980s, 1990s, I don't know, and you could then go and just tell the same person, and almost certainly that information would disseminate in a similar pattern and probably find a sort of block, because if you hadn't been to your bridge meeting on Friday, you probably wouldn't have seen those people to share it with. I think we were just in a very different world, and I've certainly seen the change in that. But nowadays, if something goes out on one post on Facebook, or there are other social media sites available, and that then gets shared into a plethora of other places that you can't necessarily see, because those people, you might not have access to their profiles. Commentary goes on to that then gets shared again, but it's little steps of disinformation as you go along, and I just don't know how do you resolve that? And I don't have the answer to that question, but I think we have seen Brexit, I think, does get talked about a lot in this regard, how something that is said, sometimes because it's politically beneficial for a group to say something that suits an agenda, sometimes because something's been misinterpreted, that then causes a snowball effect, and then people make a decision about something that later, when you start to interrogate it, they're not sure that actually the decision they made is the thing they would stand by, or they hadn't realised the unintended consequences of the decision they made. And I think that then talks to that, what's the question, what's the thing we're actually asking? So as I say, the more I started to think about this motion, I think the more concerns I had.
There was a lot of talk about eye-watering costs. You also mentioned eye-watering costs. What's your take on people's perception that everything to do with climate has eye-watering costs?
So I just don't believe it's the case, actually. When we look at the initially allocated fund of money towards climate change, that's the number that's then been used over and over again. And I think I've talked to people who think that's an annual amount that we're spending on climate change. And if it was, I think there would probably be a legitimate question to be answered. The reality is there was a fund that was set aside. We then apply into that fund for certain projects. The biggest one, we said 80% of the £8.5 million spending has gone on energy efficiency scheme. That's through the actual DEFRA energy efficiency scheme and the Green Living Grant scheme, all being put into people's pockets to make material changes and improvements to their own properties. So I think there's so many different facets to what we're trying to do at the minute, whether it be those direct impact where we see a benefit to people, and then the co-benefit is that we should see a reduction in emissions and a reduction in usage of energy. Whether it be flood defences, where we look at work we're doing to mitigate the risk of flood damage around our island. And the risk and opportunities report that's been issued talks very much actually about where are those risks on the island. And I mean, actually the opportunities is such a small number compared to the risks, just by virtue of our position around the world and our own geography. But all of those then will need adaptation strategies, and that adaptation is going to cost a significant amount of money. But in all cases, pretty much, I would argue, it's less than the cost of doing nothing. And I think that's really important to understand. So flooding is a good example. If you don't make the adaptation, obviously you have the cost of the damage, and that then has to be remedied. Equally with energy efficiency, if you don't make the changes to your properties, then the cost is the increased cost of energy. And we know that at the minute, until we make those changes with our energy system, we are absolutely exposed to the volatility of global energy prices.
Do you think the residents are convinced by the actions that government has been taking with regards to climate change? Because just to give you an example, like you said, the energy efficiency schemes, those have been relatively small in the whole scale of climate. So do you think people feel disconnected because they see climate as this huge challenge we're facing, but then they hear of wall insulation being handed out, but then they see wind turbine proposals and they kind of can't work out how those go hand in hand?
I think there is an element of that. We had to start somewhere, and the things that we can do fairly quickly and easily in terms of deployment sit around things like energy efficiency. And obviously we have a new scheme that we're almost ready to launch that will take over from those schemes and look to provide a sort of more significant payments for people with bigger infrastructure. And then we have the piece around energy, and we know that the single biggest factor that will change our emissions as an island will be our energy system. And there are a number of different pieces of that jigsaw that we're working on through the energy strategy. We had hoped to have that in Tynwald in November. The reality is the moving parts are more significant, I think, than we had hoped. And that's going to be in Q1 of 2026 that we'll be bringing that now, because we felt actually trying to bring it when it's not ready probably was not helpful and would probably confuse the situation more. So I absolutely appreciate there's so many different elements, but what we absolutely are trying to do is make decisions that are no regrets options, the things that would make sense even if we weren't doing them for the benefit of reducing our emissions. But the co-benefit of reducing our emissions would seem to me to be something that would be unfortunate not to talk about and not to aim for.
That was Douglas East MHK Claire Barber. Next, Chris Thomas moved 2 motions in Tynwald.
Maybe we begin with the freedom of information one. What was that all about?
So we have some publicly owned companies which meet the definition for inclusion in the Freedom of Information Act. Government's position was that we were still reviewing whether they should be included or not. And I think Tynwald today, although we've got subject to a combined vote, told government that they should be included. That's the Manx Development Corporation, Isle of Man Meats and the Steam Packet Company. Also, unusually, it was revealed that there will be an amendment to achieve what we've agreed. I hope we agree, or I move to achieve in Tynwald in the House of Keys, perhaps before we even have the combined vote in January. So you can amend the Freedom of Information Act along the lines that I moved for. I've been working with Mr. Hooper on this for some months.
And what I suppose we should also add is Manx Radio weren't particularly looking to be removed from the Freedom of Information regime.
That's right. I just made the case that if they were included, why wouldn't larger companies with more causing more financial exposure to the Isle of Man government be included? I just used it as a debating point.
So then moving on to the exploration of hydrocarbons. I mean, this has died a death. Why are you trying to resurrect this one?
Oh, it really hasn't. The gas that's there in the sandstone has been there for a long, long, long time. We've had 3 licences on that gas field. The gas reserves are proven. There is a process that can be used. It's not risk-free. It's certainly risky, but there's a process of managing it. And I moved today with the support of 10 MHKs and I think even 1 MLC that we should relicense that gas field. And I kept stressing that even if we lose today, this is a general election issue. Very disappointingly, government didn't read the room in that, and they also voted against receiving a report on the issues about the regulations regime, the consenting regime, the co-location of wind and gas, and also about seismic versus drilling, all those issues. So now it'll be for candidates to get the information that they want rather than having a reliable government report to inform the election, which to me is startling given what was just said in the net zero referendum about how the election was the place to determine these policy decisions.
What you did say in that debate was that you felt that there would have been some members of the Council of Ministers who might have liked to support what you were doing. And had they done so, I mean, if there were, you referenced more than one, so if there were 2, then the 13 votes would have gone down to 11 and your 10 votes would have gone up to 12.
True, and I think there's probably 3 in the Council of Ministers who are that way. There are others who might have been persuaded. So yes, it's a live issue. There are certainly ministers who will say that they had to vote the way they did because of collective responsibility. On that basis, I'm quite surprised that the Chief Minister couldn't absolve the ministers from collective responsibility on at least the report writing. But hey, I'm always saying he's a prisoner in his own Council of Ministers, and Council of Ministers is green by the sound of it.
You're always saying that. Does anyone else say that?
I think they do now, yeah. I think people refer to the fact that I've said it, but it did come up in Keys today that I've successfully said it so many times that it's become part of the talking point.
Douglas Central MHK Chris Thomas there. Finally, John Wannenburgh moved a motion in support of the Manx National Farmers Union's call for government to do more to support Manx producers.
Now, to me, it's obvious why any Tynwald member would want to do that, but what was your motivation in bringing this forward?
Well, thank you. The first thing I'll say is that the Farmers Union asked me to do it, and I'm very pleased to have done it for them. But you're absolutely right. This should be important to everybody. And to my mind, the 2 most important things, and I've said it to you before, Phil, is energy security and food security. There are 2 main components if we are going to be surviving as an island in the future. We've got to get these things right. And so this fitted in very well with what I think.
And of course, earlier in the week, when during the first day of the Tynwald sitting, there was a massive big storm. Boats didn't sail, food didn't arrive, and there was a time when we could rely on Manx producers to fill the shelves for us. This is becoming decreasingly likely as we seem to become more and more reliant on imported food, would you say?
Well, I mean, that's a matter of fact. I mean, I think the DEFRA Minister stated it was 6% of food consumed on the Isle of Man is made on the Isle of Man, if you like. That is a shocking statistic, and it is understandable to a certain way. In fact, that supermarkets are here and people want to go and buy food cheaply or whatever the case is. But you've really got to interrogate what you purchase. The provenance from the Isle of Man, first class. The actual quality of the food, first class. Yes, it does cost more, but it's more than just the money. It's supporting the community. That's what we should all be doing. And that is not to say that I do not understand when families who are struggling to, with the cost of living, I completely understand where they go when they want the cheapest food. Absolutely. But then we've got to give them the choice as well. And that's what this petition was about.
And of course, if we had lengthy spells of storms, actually there wouldn't be anywhere to go for food, I suppose.
Well, again, that's stating the obvious, absolutely. And the problem with that is that, the local producers will then have to scale up very quickly. And unfortunately, you don't just grow a tomato or a potato in 24 hours. It takes time. And they, of course, the producers will want, surety of what they grow they can sell. And it's a vicious circle. But and I suppose we need to change our purchasing habits. Everybody wants the cheapest possible thing, and they want it today. And whether it's a banana or a pumpkin or a pawpaw, they want it today. They don't want to wait. And I think there is no respect really for the very little respect for the way that food is actually grown and delivered to us in the supermarkets.
Your motion was amended inevitably. Isle of Man Government Council of Ministers doesn't like to allow the backbenchers to get away with everything that they're asking for. The amendment, do you think that waters down too much what you were trying to achieve?
You're only going to achieve anything in this place by doing it with other people, whether they're in the government or whether they're not. So I take that on the chin. Some of it was well intended. I'm happy to go forward. It does progress it. It moves the dial. Certainly, it's not everything we wanted, but, we're here for a while, aren't we? But we're in a better place than we were this time yesterday.
And in terms of that amendment, I mean, pretty much it was saying rather than Tynwald having a clear view and Tynwald taking control of this was basically saying back to the Department of Environment, Food and Agriculture and the Tynwald approved food security strategy to start delivering.
Well, I think it reversed it from Tynwald to the Isle of Man government. And to be honest, that's what it should have stated in the first place. That's where the purchasing power is. That's where the operation happens. And whether it's Department of Education, and I see Daphne's really moved that one forward. But we also need to look at other things, maybe the schools, the hospital, prisons and so on. We need to push it as far as we can. And that's not going to happen through Tynwald. That's going to happen through the departments. That's going to happen through the ministers. That's going to happen through the department plans. That's where that's going to happen.
So you'd be pleased anyway that even though it was amended slightly, you got a resounding amount of support for what you were trying to achieve.
Yes, and I think that underlines the commitment by all the politicians, front benchers, back benchers, whatever the case is. But really, the credit must go to the NFU and to the 1,800 people who signed that petition. That's what got this going. Power to the people, Phil. Absolutely.
That was Douglas North MHK John Wannenburgh. For now, I'm Phil Gorn. Go to Mayo. Thanks for listening.